We begin with the standoff over Ukraine. President Joe Biden is speaking with Russian President Vladimir Putin as fears grow that Moscow could launch an attack on Ukraine in a matter of days. This comes as the State Department orders non-emergency employees to leave the U.S. Embassy in Kyiv and urges Americans to leave Ukraine. Russia has staged most of the forces it needs to launch a full-scale invasion. Meanwhile, the U.S. is deploying more forces to Eastern Europe. CBS News correspondent Christina Ruffini begins our coverage.
If you stay, you are assuming risk with no guarantee that there will be any other opportunity to leave and no prospect of a U.S. military evacuation.
National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan repeated warnings that the State Department has issued for weeks. But the message for Americans to leave Ukraine came with a new sense of urgency.
We obviously cannot predict the future. We don't know exactly what is going to happen. But the risk is now high enough, and the threat is now immediate enough, that this is what prudence demands.
U.S. officials say Russia now has 80% of the forces it will need to launch a full-scale invasion, and the rest are en route. More than 100,000 Russian troops are amassed along Ukraine's borders, to the east in Russia and the north in Belarus.
We're in a window when an invasion could begin at any time. And to be clear, that includes during the Olympics.
Friday, the Pentagon announced it's sending 3,000 more troops into Poland. They will join the 3,000 others already there and in Romania to reinforce allies should Putin decide to make a move. But the White House says the American military is not going into Ukraine to fight Russia or even to help evacuations.
That's a world war when Americans and Russians start shooting at one another.
In an interview with NBC, President Biden said Russian President Vladimir Putin knows not to put American lives at risk.
I'm hoping that if, in fact, he's foolish enough to go in, he's smart enough not to, in fact, do anything that would negatively impact on American citizens.
Now, CBS News has learned there's about 7,000 Americans who have registered with the embassy there saying, yes, I'm American, I'm here, and I might want information or help getting out of the country. But there could be as many as 30,000 dual citizens, permanent residents, people who live in Ukraine but have some sort of U.S. citizenship who may or may not want to leave. A lot of them have family, businesses, and homes that they're not ready to walk away from until they feel there's a real imminent threat. Anna?
Christina, why is the U.S. having most staff leave the embassy in Kyiv? What does that mean?
Well, I asked a senior official on a background call today, what does it mean that you're evacuating this embassy? And they were very quick to correct me and say, we're not evacuating the embassy. The embassy is not empty in Kyiv. However, it's a very, very minimal amount of staff, and it's going to be closed to embassy services. If you need a passport, if you need a visa, if you need help, you're not going there. Instead, what they're doing is they're setting up essentially a fallback position in a town called Lviv, which is closer to the Polish border. So I think the idea is it's out of the way of any potential bombing of the capital, and it's much closer to where we have another embassy in Poland and where all those U.S. forces are stationed in case they really need to get out. But the thing to remember here is President Biden has said, as you just heard, those U.S. forces are not crossing the border. They are not coming into Ukraine. And the White House said yesterday, look, it is more than past time if you are a private citizen to get out of this country. We have warned you. We have been warning you for weeks. The State Department has warned you. As of yesterday, they said you have about 24 to 48 hours to get out. Here are the land routes. There are commercial flights. Leave now because we're not coming to get you.
So I want to ask you about what you were saying, Christina, about troops, because the U.S. has been mobilizing troops to Poland. President Biden's been really clear that he doesn't believe that U.S. troops should be intervening necessarily in a conflict there. And earlier today, the Pentagon ordered some State Guard, some National Guard troops out of Ukraine. What more can you tell us about that?
So there was a very small contingent of National Guard forces who were helping train Ukrainian forces, I believe in the Donbass, not exactly on the front line, but a little bit closer to where the action has been happening. They're being ordered out, and that's because that goes to what President Biden was saying. He doesn't want any situation where an American is firing at a Russian, because he says that's how you start World War III. So all the forces that have gone in, he initially sent about 2,000 forces to Poland. There's about 1,000 Romania. And then yesterday, the DoD said it's sending more troops, 3,000 more troops to go reinforce those locations. It's important to emphasize these folks are not going into Ukraine, and I think that's something that's been a little bit lost. No one is saying U.S. forces are going into Ukraine to fight Russia. What the Biden administration is saying is that if Putin's territorial aspirations don't stop at the Ukrainian border, the U.S. has a sacred obligation to our NATO allies to help make sure they have the capacity to push back against that. And allies in the region are especially nervous. You know, Poland has been occupied by the Soviets before, as have Romania. This is not new to them, and they can see this coming, and they want to make sure there's a strong bulwark against any kind of further Russian aggression. Obviously, the White House says it hopes Putin changes its mind. The presidents, Putin and Biden, talked earlier this morning. We're waiting for a readout on that call. That call was initiated by Russia, so that's a little bit interesting. We'll have to see what they wanted to say. The initial thought was that President Putin would not want to invade before the Olympics were over. That has now changed, and the White House said it could come at any time, which is why they're evacuating the embassy, which is why they're pulling those National Guard forces out, and why they're saying over and over and over again, if you're an American and you're in Ukraine, leave now.
All right, Christina, thank you. From Washington, let's turn to Kyiv. CBS News foreign correspondent Imtiaz Tyab joins us for a sense of what's happening inside Ukraine. Imtiaz, you've been there for about a week now. Tell us, how's the public reaction to what's happening different from when you first arrived? Have you noticed a sense, it feels here in the U.S. like things have become more urgent?
Hey, Lana, good to talk to you. Yeah, it's been very interesting to sort of see how things have evolved. Obviously, in the U.S., this sense of urgency, this sense of palpable fear, very much in the air. But here in Ukraine, really for the last week or so since I've been here, it's felt very different. A week ago when I arrived, people were living their lives as normal, going to restaurants, going to bars, going to work, and generally carrying on with their lives. But something changed today. Today, we saw a very large protest here in the capital, Kyiv, where you saw people take to the streets to march in opposition of war, accusing Vladimir Putin of being a war criminal. But one woman we heard from said that, yes, she's scared, but she's not panicking. Lana.
Well, Russian and Belarusian forces have been holding some of the largest live-fire military exercises since the Cold War, Imtiaz. How is Ukraine responding? And tell us a little bit about the weather there and how that potentially impacts everything.
Yeah, you look at those images of those drills in Belarus and it's apocalyptic. You just see this huge military presence, this huge live fire drill. We understand 30,000 Russian forces are involved in that. And we have to remember that those Russian forces stretch around Ukraine right now. We also have many Russian forces on the border with Russia and in the Black Sea. A number of Russian warships have arrived as well. All of that, of course, is no doubt very concerning, and many see it as a pretext or a prelude to war. Now, in saying that, there has been a lot of talk about what could trigger this war, what could trigger this invasion, and more importantly, what Vladimir Putin is waiting for. Some have suggested it's the weather, that he wants the ground to freeze before crossing over with his tanks and heavy weaponry. I was just up in the north, in the northern border area between Belarus and Ukraine. It is very mild there. It doesn't seem as if the land is going to freeze, or more importantly, if that really is even the calculus. All of that is to say that this is a very tense situation, a situation that could become very dire very quickly. Lana.
Imtiaz, thank you. And be sure to stay with CBS News for all the developments between Ukraine and Russia. The situation is changing by the hour, and our full team of correspondents are working through the weekend. We'll have continuing coverage.